Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's IPC Partners Journal Club. It seems like only 30 seconds since we did the last one, but today it's just me and Phil. Phil, seems like a while since it was just you and me.
It does actually. We've had so many guests on, so it does seem a while since it's just been the two of us.
But I think we're enough to have fun, right?
We'll see.
Okay, so look, you've got some exciting news, Phil. Go on, tell us. New job.
Yeah, I do. I've got a new job working at the Brighton and Sussex Medical School, with James Price and Mood Buta. I'm going to be leading a program of research, kind of around about IPC and sustainability, looking at whether or not we can safely reuse medical devices and products. So, is there a role for decontamination in effective decontamination of medical devices so they can be reused? So, yeah, started Monday, so still very fresh, but really enjoying it so far.
Fantastic. Congratulations on an important topic area. And it's
Cheers.
official, IPC is not the enemy of sustainability. Phil is proving it day by
I'll
day.
t yeah, I'll tell you in 18 months maybe.
Okay, great. So today, Phil is going to present a paper in the Journal of Hospital Infection, a scoping review of disinfection strategies for CPE in hospital water systems. So Phil, I presume you're going to have all the answers and a perfect solution to this problem, right?
Uh, Very different actually. Lots of varied approaches, some successful, some not, but a lot of variety, which is why I'm really interested in the paper.
All right, great. So let's before we hand over to Phil, just have a little look at what we're trying to achieve with this journal club. So we want to try and provide some insight into a topical paper, generate discussion, and you'll see a little Q&A box at the top of your portal. So if you have a question, put it in there as Phil is going through the paper. Don't wait till the end, otherwise we get a flood of questions and it's quite hard to go through them. We're interested in yours and our CPD. We want this to be an environment for critical thinking, so we really tear the paper apart in a constructive way to try and really understand what it's telling us and what it's not telling us. And part of the reason for doing that is to build confidence so that you can go away and do your independent study as a network of enthusiasts, and ideally having a little bit of fun as we go. So all of the journal clubs are published on YouTube after the event. So I think, Phil, without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, John. So yeah, as John said, I'm going to be talking about this paper, which is published very recently and was actually in press in the Journal of Hospital Infection. It was really good to see a lot of engagement with some of the social media posts that we put out around this paper. I think we actually had the author talking about this journal club. So I'm hoping that maybe even some of the authors are on the call today to talk about this paper. So, as I said, it's just published recently, looking at disinfection strategies for CPE. So we always like to start with why we chose this paper. I think the first thing to say, which I haven't really put on this slide, is that I'm just fascinated by the role of biofilms and how they are a vehicle for organisms to survive in the environment, both in wet and dry conditions, and looking about how they play a role in the transmission of some infections, particularly in lots of vulnerable patients as well. So we tend to see a lot of these infections in people who are in intensive care. There's a really good analysis done in Germany looking at sinks in intensive care units and comparing them to infection rates with rooms that didn't have sinks. And the rooms with the sinks in had higher rates of infection. So we're kind of really starting to evidence this link between water, biofilms, and sinks, and the transmission of some of these really dangerous and nasty infections. So I've always been interested in the role of water, but I'm also really interested in how we tackle that challenge. So how do we actually eradicate the problem? The problem with water is that we know that we're always going to get and promote bacterial growth. If we think about how we use sinks in healthcare, we're always feeding that community of microorganisms, whether or not it's because we're putting things down there like fluids, IV fluids, or antibiotics. I've read a couple of papers where there's a whole plethora of things that are put down sinks. So I'm really interested in how we manage those things that grow in a biofilm and how we can use disinfection to control outbreaks. And I think the reason why this paper took my eye is that I've seen tons of research published on different methods. So I wanted to see really if this could identify, which ones were the best, and if there was any kind of commonality in that For example, sodium hypochlorite always performed really, really well, but peracetic acid didn't. So that's one of the reasons I was interested. I've also done some work myself around disinfection of hand wash basins. I did some work with Mark Garvey at the University Hospital Birmingham recently, and Martin Wilkinson looking at the effect of UVC decontamination or disinfection, sorry, on contamination of hand wash basins. This is kind of a continuous UVC exposure, which is mentioned in this paper as well. Not my research, but the role of UVC. But also the fact that there's lots of variation in all the different approaches that we can take. So we can look at different technologies, different chemistries, and what about the frequency and how long we apply these disinfectants for? Because we know that quite often if we cease disinfection, then it can allow the biofilm to come back. So loads of reasons why I chose this article. So what do they do? It's a scoping review, and they use some well-known and kind of mandatory observed guidelines for their reporting. So looking at things like Prisma and a Prisma extension. As part of that analysis, that framework that they put forward, defining their search terms, etc., they identified 1,188 records, and after they screened them, 22 of them met the inclusion criteria. So 22 individual studies were focused on within this scoping review. They then, authors did some thematic analysis and put the different interventions or the different disinfection strategies into different pots, chemical, physical, and integrative strategies. So integrative strategies, ones which maybe combine chemical and physical disinfection or decontamination strategies. And they looked at these both in proactive water management and reactive interventions during known contamination or outbreaks. I think 3 years ago, when I started reading more and more about the role of water, it was always kind of being done reactively because we knew there was an outbreak in an intensive care unit and we couldn't find the source of it. And people were looking in water systems probably towards the end of their investigation or analysis. Now I think people are looking a bit more proactively. So it's good to see that both proactive and reactive studies were included. They didn't look at surfaces studies which looked at surface or air disinfection or non-healthcare settings or any other studies which looked at non-CPE bacteria. So just focusing specifically on the carbapenemase-producing Enterobacterales, which is this massive family, as we know, of gram-negative organisms that are really resistant to some of our stronger antibiotics and can cause real nasty infection. So this is how they set up their scope and review. So what did they find? Well, I've tried to break this down over 3 slides, I think, just talking about the diversity of the different organisms that they found. So you can see here the different species that were found in these different 22 studies. Ones that I'm all quite familiar with, really. There were none out there that I hadn't heard about before. Maybe I've heard about Citrobacter, being a big challenge when it comes to biofilms and drains and transmission of infections, but not Citrobacter farma. So that was the only species that I hadn't heard of. But a lot of these will be species of CPE or gram-negative bacteria that we are familiar with when it comes to the risk of water and transmission of infections from sinks and biofilms and drains, etc. Serraceum ascens, again, very good at causing outbreaks from linked to wet environments in vulnerable patients. And some of these infections can have really high levels of morbidity and mortality as well in vulnerable patient groups. The other thing that I thought was really nice, which the paper did, was they took the different enzymes that were responsible for giving that carbapenemase activity. So again, a high diversity of different enzymes here. Things that we're probably quite familiar with in the infection control world, OXA48, KPCs, New Delhi, NDMs. So lots of variety here in the different enzymes encoding those resistance to these carbapenem antibiotics. And then I've just tried to summarize the different disinfectant approaches and different physical approaches that the scope and review picked out. So this is my first kind of take-home message really from my analysis of the paper, is that there was lots of variation in the different disinfectant approaches used. People were using quaternium ammonium compounds, which, to be honest, really, really surprised me, mainly because I don't consider quaternium ammonium compounds to have a really high level of disinfectant activity. We know they have some good bacterial and virucidal activity, but they're not as strong as some of our oxidizing agents like peracetic acid or hydrogen peroxide. So I was really interested about the use of quaternary ammonium compounds in some of the studies that this review identified. Good old-fashioned sodium hypochlorite or bleach at a variety of different concentrations, some quite low. I question the efficacy of 0.5%, whereas 5.5 is probably quite hardy and giving you quite high power when it comes to antimicrobial efficacy. Hydrogen peroxide, which again I've associated quite often with disinfection of drains. Acetic acid, again, in maybe some of the earlier literature, but lots of challenges around health and safety. Descaling agents were also included, but I think that was in combination with some of the disinfectants that we use. But one thing I was really surprised, and I think this was maybe in more of the studies which combined integrative approaches, is they talked about disinfection, but they didn't specify the actual disinfectant that they were using. So I think that's maybe not a limitation of this study, but a limitation of some of the other papers that were included in the analysis. Because I think, defining the disinfectant that you use is really, really important. And then look at all these physical approaches that were included. Replacement of lots of different parts of the sink, redesign of things like toilets and sinks. So we know in sinks, for example, we can move the position of the drain, we can change the shape of the basin to reduce splash, etc. So there's loads of physical approaches as well. I really like one of the studies that this scope and review put out, which is around the use of heating and vibration within sink traps. So the idea of using heat or vibration to kind of remove that biofilm. Why I think that's so important is because, a biofilm is a gloopy mess effectively. So the disinfectant might not be able to penetrate it. So having that vibration would be a really good way to be able to potentially break up the biofilm and allow then the disinfectants to penetrate. So first key finding really is that lots of variation in the different studies that this review analysed, some using integrative, combining the two, and others using just some either disinfection or physical approaches in silo. I think the other thing to highlight is that why I think we need to be more going down either the proactive or design or disinfection as opposed to the physical approach is that we just don't have the money to constantly remove sinks or replace parts. There's huge disruption and cost associated with that. So I think we need to think more proactively about how we kind of design better interventions into our sinks and water containing systems to reduce the risk of transmission of infections. The other thing as well, which I think surprised me as well, is that a lot of the studies talked about the importance of staff education, which again is integral, isn't it? We often talk about policy into practice. So if we develop a policy which says that you must disinfect your sink with X, Y, and Z and this period and this frequency, it's really important we train our staff on how to do that, don't we? And I think there's a huge role for education to play in educating our clinical professionals and healthcare workers about the risks of water and how we can think about better behaviour to keep the healthcare environment safe from the risk of water. Other key findings that they found, some of the studies were using kind of point of use filtration, which often offered reliable and short-term protection. When I was working in the NHS at Oxford, we used pointer filters a lot. The challenge was that they always remained in place for long, long periods of time. So again, they do offer very good, reliable short-term protection, but how do we move to taking them off and moving away from them and using just in the interim? What do we need to do to be able to keep the water system safe? Variable efficacy when it comes to the different chemical disinfectants. And I think this is a really important finding from this paper because I wanted it to potentially show me that this disinfectant always proved to be the best when it came to disinfecting our water system. And unfortunately, it didn't. There was lots and lots of variation. Physical and mechanical disinfection showed a lot of good promise. So steam cleaning, mechanical modifications and source removal were all really effective in the studies analysed of reducing outbreaks and colonisation of CPE. But it was integrated strategies which tended to be the most effective. So this is where they're combining disinfection with either upgrades or training and the implementation of IPC policies, which is probably what you'd expect, isn't it, by combining them. And often as the last bullet point says, recolonization after interventions was common. So really highlights the need for sustained strategies. So, this is a great paper showing us about some of the options, but I think the learning is how we take that on and integrate it into routine care. I just wanted to pick out one of the particular studies because I love biofilms, and this was one of the papers that were included in the scope and review. This was a 4-year long outbreak in an intensive care year in Belgium of a VIM and NDM CPE. And they used a specifically biofilm degrading enzymatic product along with peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide. I think this is one of the first mentions where I've seen a specific product being used that uses an enzyme to break down biofilm, which again, from my own understanding of biofilm, I think is vital because we think about that biofilm, that gloopy matrix. How do we break that down to allow the disinfectants to get into it and penetrate? So I thought this was a really interesting study to highlight. And lo and behold, the results were really good. They saw a massive reduction in CPE. They didn't detect any CPE isolates for 7 months. And this is a direct extract from the scoping review. Careful biocide selection, physical cleaning, integration, and stringent regulatory oversight are essential to achieve effective long-term sustainable infection control without promoting resistance. I thought that was a really nice summary kind of statement about how all these different factors that we need to consider are really important to make sure that we have a long-term and sustainable infection control policy. I really enjoyed how the paper then went and talked about the potential for novel disinfectant approaches. And these are just a couple that the paper talked about. So I guess for those of you who haven't read the paper, the analysis was all done on those 22 studies and talked about limitations and benefits and advantages of some of the different strategies, then talked about where the future might lie. So nanoparticles, looking at things like silver and copper, really may be advantageous because they reduce the need for reapplication of disinfectants. Genetically engineered bacteriophages, which sound a bit futuristic, but this is the use of viruses that attack bacteria and using them to essentially affect and kill bacteria, harmless to humans, I hope, but maybe a good novel anti-biofilm technique. The idea of self-disinfecting siphons using things like electrochemical vibration or antimicrobial coatings. And then just some of the other kind of areas that we've touched on really briefly, the use of UV light, which I talked about and has shown some promise in a study that I was involved in, things like ozonated water as well. But effectively, to combine all of those things, we need interdisciplinary research that brings in microbiology, engineering, public health, data science. I'd also add academia to that because I think it's really important that we have that kind of knowledge exchange between healthcare, academia, and also industry as well, because we need to constantly innovate in this space. So again, just a really nice way that the paper did some forward-looking thinking for what the future might hold. So what did I take from all of this paper? I think there's questions for me about how we standardize our testing and evaluate our efficacy of disinfectants, particularly against biofilms. The paper did a great job of showing about all the different strategies and how they all had a role in kind of cessation or stopping the spread or outbreaks that were ongoing in the relevant studies. But, how do we kind of take those learnings and put them into a standardized methodology where we are coming away with a real focused area of parameters where we know that we are constantly giving the disinfectants the same challenge and that they can be applied in the real world, not just the lab setting. So I think there's some challenges there about how we standardize testing. Do we think about continuous disinfectant? So, we've talked about potentially the use of things like hypochlorous acid and adding that in safe concentrations to our water sources. And again, I've seen some studies which shown promise. How do we monitor biofilm buildup as well? I think that's another kind of key question. Quite often, a lot of these responses are reactive. So can we be more proactive, as the paper highlights, is often shown as being valuable? How can we effectively monitor biofilm buildup? We always look at our TVCs, don't we, and our water counts to check that our water is safe. But how can we think about monitoring biofilm buildup? Because I think when we've got biofilm, we know we've got a problem because that biofilm is constantly seeding our water system. And ultimately, how do we continue to innovate in this space? How do we combine the kind of trifecta of clinical, academia, and industry to make sure that we're looking at new systems and technologies to keep our water system safe? So lots of things for discussion. What does this paper mean for IPC? I think it shows that early detection and ongoing monitoring are essential. It shows that physical and engineering-led solutions can often be required and show a lot of success. We've already talked about point of use filters. I don't have on here that we've got efficacy shown from disinfectants, but they have different variability in how good they perform, and also what happens when we challenge them against different groups of bacteria as well. This focuses just on CPE, which actually probably represent the vast majority of challenges and gram negatives that we get when it comes to problems from water. But do we need to look at about efficacy against other organisms as well? I think it shows that we need to coordinate different areas of our healthcare settings as well. So we need IPC and our estates and facilities to ensure that we are working through our water safety meetings, etc., to make sure that there's a combined and integrated approach. And I think this was maybe just a kind of final thought from the paper. We need to think that water planning and water safety is embedded into routine operations rather than delivered reactively, because we know that the threat is always going to be there. Okay, yeah, I'm going to stop there, John, and hand back to you.
Thanks, Phil. Really, really interesting overview and very nicely done. So I have got literally a whole page full of questions, but I'm going to try and restrain myself to not ask them all and let the audience have a go. So please put your questions into the Q&A. When I say I've got a page full of questions, it's actually a post-it note, so not a massive page. I was down in our utility room yesterday, trying to clean out the waste of our washing machine. And as I got, opened up the pipework, it is disgusting down there. It's a kind of gooey mess, and I'd imagine that's pretty similar to a hospital drain system as well, perhaps even worse. So let me just ask one quick question before I go to the Q&A. So this article the review identified 22 articles,
Right.
and they restricted it only to CPE. Do you think that was the right call, or should they have been a bit broader in their search terms and actually had more literature? Because I'm sure there's many more than 22 articles in this area.
That's a really good question. No, I think actually, because I think I talked about it at the end, we know that the risk from water and CPE is obviously, really great. And I think it's good to just highlight the spotlight on organisms of concern when it comes to water and transmission of infections. It would have been great to open it up to other organisms as well. I'm just trying to think, what things would be outside of CPE that I would have really liked to see. What do you think, John?
I think I would have liked to see a diversity of organisms, because yes, I'm worried about CP, but there's a lot more down the drain.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what their search terms were, but it feels like they must have been quite narrow to only come up with 22 articles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To pull in, the basic science and the clinical research and the outcomes based stuff, because some people have shown that if you do a better job of drainage disinfection, you do see some changes in colonization and infection.
Yeah, I guess the only maybe limitation of just having CPE is obviously that's very defined, whereas there could be studies looking at just biofilm, and they're not actually able to, unless they use genetic methods, they're not actually able to type what's there. But it would be good to maybe just see efficacy against biofilm, because we know probably that
Yeah.
90% of the cases that we're looking at, that biofilm is probably multi-species. So I think that their terminology really was focusing on the outbreak that was going on, and then they were talking about how they assumed, or they were detecting in some cases, that organism in the water system, and then going on and putting in the interventions that way. But I think, yeah, if you had a more broader technique or search term around biofilm, I think that would also open up a lot more of the academic work that's probably going on.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's go to the Q&A from the audience. Thanks for your question here, Joma. The question is, how do point of use filters help to address drain contamination? And was it the water itself that was the source of the contamination?
Yeah, very good question. Obviously, the point of use filtration filters are only blocking what's coming out of the water itself, but they're also preventing it going down the drain as well. I think that was merely a reactive approach in the papers that were using point of use filters. So looking at a challenge around, I can't recall exactly if they were detecting the contamination of the water, but you're right. The point of use filters are only there to kind of filter out organisms in the water itself. They will stop those organisms going down into the drain, but I'm assuming that they were detecting contamination in the water, not the drain. So that's why they put the point of use filters in those studies. But yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to reflect really on the different risks that are related to hospital water. It's certainly not a homogeneous risk. So we've got the risk of supply water being contaminated with Legionella and Pseudomonas principally, and that causing one set of issues. And then we've got a separate issue of the drain being contaminated with CPE or other antibiotic resistant organisms that somehow finds its way back into the clinical environment. So yeah, point of use filters definitely have a role. I mean, could you put a reverse filter in the drain to stop the organisms coming back up?
It's a really good question, isn't it? Yeah. Does the same principle apply? Because I'm just trying to think of water going in a separate direction, but it's all around. Is that effective against biofilm? Is the other thing. Obviously, the size of the filters is there to trap the organisms within it. I always remember, and it was Martin Kiernan who I think first told me about the study where they'd put this kind of fluorescent E. coli into a U-bend so they could detect it using light. And they were showing that if you fed the E. coli in the trap, it was growing a centimetre or an inch maybe a day
Wow.
up the U-bend. So I'm not sure your filter is going to be effective against that, unless you could have one maybe that maybe like a plug. There's some studies on there that talk about drain plugs, but obviously they've got to be able to let the water through. So could you have some
Yeah.
intelligent system that
Yeah.
opens when the water comes through and then closes to prevent the biofilm buildup? That would be nice.
Yeah, that would be good. And I think that would help with the pushback I was going to have to my own suggestion, which is flow, water flow. We know drains drain or sinks drain slowly, and that causes issues in and of itself. Okay, so you mentioned a few times how we assess the effectiveness of these interventions to reduce drain contamination. So how do we measure the effectiveness of drain decontamination?
I think it's good old fashioned microbial sampling. Sticking a swab down the drain and putting it onto an agar plate and seeing what you get. I've seen more and more studies doing more kind of genetic methods. So, metagenomics, where you go and extract the DNA of what's in the biofilm, and you do your intervention and you compare before and after. But obviously that's expensive and isn't maybe accessible to everybody. But, going back to my first point about using a traditional microbial analysis, and John, you and I wrote to JHI about this, is there's so much variation. Where in the water system do you sample? How far down do you go? What agar do you use? How do you standardize that methodology? And I guess maybe that ties into one of the points I was trying to make in my analysis of the paper is, how do we standardize the testing so we can have a more comparable body of evidence? So if I know that we've got a CPE outbreak in Glasgow and one in South Wales, and we've gone and analysed what's in the biofilm in the same way and done different disinfectant approaches, I could probably make a clearer decision on which disinfectant performs the best. Whereas if we're using different sampling techniques and bringing in variation, we might, get rid of the outbreak. But, what's actually going on within that microbial community? Is it just down to non-detectable levels? How long does it take to come back? So I think there's a lot to be said for to answer your question. Various ways to do it, lots of variability, which is a challenge. I have a limited amount of money. I'd go and do metabolomics on every sample and look at the DNA and the composition of the bacteria that are there.
Okay, great. And yeah, comparative effectiveness is something we've talked about quite a lot. We need to do it with all these interventions to test them all under the same conditions, ideally literally side by side, so we can begin to make some judgments around which approach is more effective. Okay, next question from Sanger, thank you. So the issue being flagged here is the age-old problem of hand washing sinks being used for tasks other than hand washing. And I recall the data that shows, I think on average, 4% of the uses of a hand wash sink is actually hand washing, or maybe it was 6%, but it wasn't very much. So the question is, could you advise on the best approach to ensure that hand wash sinks are used exclusively for hand washing?
I mean, this ties into an area of healthcare and IPC that I don't know much about, but I'm fascinated with. But it's this human behavior side of things. How do we ensure that people do the right thing, and how do we make it easy for them to do the right thing? I think my own experience of healthcare is that it can often be chaotic and challenging, and you often look for the least path of resistance. So if you've got something need to get rid of, you pour it down the sink. So how can we kind of train people to make sure that they make the right decisions? I'd have liked in this paper to seen them, and maybe I probably needed to go into the individual papers in a bit more detail to look at the education that was involved in supporting the ceasing of the different outbreaks or contaminations. So I don't think there's an easy way. I think we have to tap into the human behavior side of things. Obviously, we can put things in place like some nice visual cues and say, this is a risk if we're adding or feeding the organisms by tipping the wrong things down them, giving people education on how they should correctly dispose of them. So using things like visual cues, etc. But it's got to be about access as well. We've got sinks for everywhere, aren't they, in healthcare? So often it's easy to think about them as a big bin or a big drain. So, how can we make our kind of waste disposal more efficient or effective? Or I think it all comes down to education ultimately.
Yeah, maybe some interventions might be helpful. I wonder whether we could think of some sort of dog collar that gives you an electric shock if you pour a can of Coke down a sink. That might work.
Well, what
You
about
wouldn't.
the same approach with hand hygiene compliance? Could the hand hygiene monitoring tool also tell somebody if they've disposed of something in the wrong way, maybe? And
Yeah, so we go out eyes on, do some audit, gather some audit data, and
yeah,
say,
yeah,
X percentage of sink uses were appropriate. That would be quite confronting, I think.
yeah.
Um, and
And
yeah,
I think you're right on that study as well. I think it was 6%. So 94% of all the behaviors that they filmed weren't hand washing. And there were things like coffee, tea, antibiotics, IV fluid, 52 different behaviors other than hand washing. So I'd like to know what the other 50 were.
yeah, mainly fluid disposal, I expect. Okay, there's a question here about disinfectant standardization. So I think I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether you think we should have more standardization in disinfectant chemistries, or whether diversity is a good thing and we should see even more diversity, particularly as we try and tackle biofilms and drains.
What do you mean by diversity? Diversity in the
A
testing
diversity of
methods?
chemistries,
Chemistry,
of
sorry.
the
Yeah,
range of
yeah, okay.
chemistries available to us.
Yeah, sure. So I know there are various groups that have tried to standardize some of the ways that we analyze the efficacy of our disinfectants. There was some work I was involved in at Cardiff University with Professor Jean-Yves Maillard looking at developing a model to try and replicate biofilm. And that showed some really good promise, trying to, again, just promote these things around reproducibility so we can have the same standards in place. And the interesting bit with that work as well is that we didn't just measure efficacy, we measured, I should say, Kate Ledwick led the research. Um, we looked at how long it took for the biofilm to start growing back as well, because a lot of the time we were getting our numbers down, we were getting huge log reductions, we were getting 6, 7 log reductions, but then we were getting to undetectable levels, but the biofilm would be coming back. But the better performing disinfectants increase that time. So you would treat it with a good disinfectant, for example, and it would take 7, 8, 10 days for it to come back. Whereas the poorer performing disinfectants the biofilm would come back in 1 or 2 days. So I know there are different groups that have looked at standardizing it, and there are lots of different models available, but I don't think we're anywhere near the kind of EN standards that we have for disinfectants. If you look at the kind of bactericidal, virucidal, sporicidal testing for disinfectants for use on hard surfaces, we've got EN TAN standards coming out of our ears. But I know there are groups actively looking. I can't comment with confidence on how far away they are. And maybe Jon, you might have a light to shine on anything that might be coming in terms of standardization.
No, I'm not aware of any new
No.
relevant
Okay.
standards here, but it's important to have a standardized approach. Okay, so back to behavior. Comment from Sharon here. So staff don't always recognize the importance of misusing sinks. We try and educate them, but unless they're personally affected, it doesn't seem to get through. So how do we stop banging our heads on a brick wall here, or a copper pipe?
Or being hit with a copper pipe. Yeah, I could give loads of reasons about how I think or ways that we could do it, but I think ultimately it comes down to kind of investment in our IPC service. If you look at the kind of mandatory training that we're able to give healthcare professionals now from an IPC perspective, it's become less and less and less. Again, I think when I was working at Oxford, I'd probably want a whole day with them to be able to talk about IPC, whether or not that's ventilation, water, personal protective equipment, donning and doffing. It's so broad, whereas the reality is we get maybe an hour or two. So I think we need to invest more in IPC service to be able to provide more education. And, I refer to defer, I should say, to the human behavior specialists about how we can make sure that people take that education and they build it into their everyday practice. I really agree with what Sharon said, is that, people don't tend to make a change until they are affected by it personally, but there are probably some things that we can do along the way to help them, whether or not it's some simple visual cues, whether or not we can try and build it into, the principles around the delivery of care in individual wards, and champion our leaders, like our matrons or our sisters, to talk about, how we kind of embed that good practice. Because, it's always a challenge from IPC, isn't it? We're a team of 10 in a 1,400 bedded hospital. We can't be there all the time. So we need to make sure that we kind of recruit our internal champions and stakeholders as well.
Yep, good point. Okay, comment from Paul. Isn't a disinfectant always going to be a short-term solution? And shouldn't we be looking towards longer-term solutions to these issues? And the suggestion from Paul here is to reflect on his good experience with using heating and vibrating siphons. So how do we move towards more sustainable approaches?
That's a great comment, and I think I agree. And I think that changes the landscape about how we look at this from a reactive. So I think the new hospital program in the UK has got a huge amount of promise to make sure that we're thinking, more effectively about how we engineer in and implement techniques such as using heat or vibration. And I think that I'm actually quite encouraged by a lot of the people who are championing the new hospital program from an IPC perspective and from a water perspective. So I definitely think that there's an opportunity there with the new hospital program. I think when I also think about this, I think about not just in the UK, I think in less economically developed countries as well. So, we need to make sure that it's equitable and accessible, and there might not be the funds available to engineer in maybe some of these more expensive technologies. So I think disinfection will always have to have a place, unfortunately. And also we've got an aging healthcare estate as well, where we might not be able to replace or re-engineer. So I think we're always going to have a bit of a hybrid depending on our setting. But I definitely think for the future, the research, if you look at water-free and water-light care and the advantages that has, will be some kind of hybrid between maybe reducing risk through redesign and innovation, right through to kind of maybe removal of risk completely. So if you look at that kind of hierarchy of controls, do we go to the waterless ITU, which we've seen in the Netherlands with work of people like Hugh Topman, etc.
Yeah, I think it's good to think about this problem in the context of that hierarchy of controls. And you're right, disinfectants would be the very bottom of the pyramid, i.e. the least favorable and least effective approach we want to kind of design out to the extent possible. Okay, nice comment from Adriana here about training and education. We've talked a lot about healthcare workers. We haven't mentioned patients and visitors. So there's a lot of other people in the healthcare environment that are pouring their Coca-Cola down the sink. So everybody needs a dog collar on the way into the ward. Maybe one solution to that. Really good question from Michael here. And the question is about point of use filters for supply water, and completely buys the rationale for putting them on. But when do you take them off? How do you get sufficient assurance to actually take them off? And if I can extend that to think about drain disinfection as well, when do we stop disinfecting the drains? Is this an always solution, or is this during outbreaks? What are the triggers for starting and stopping enhanced approaches?
Again, that's just such a good question, and I think this is where I was thinking that the review might shed some light on it. I think that a lot of the studies show that as soon as you take the intervention away, then the problem comes back, which is maybe leading towards me thinking about the more continuous approach. But I don't think we've defined what that looks like yet in terms of the chemistry or the application. We talk about using things like copper silver, tends to be quite routinely used and has got some promise. But again, it's more, I personally think it needs to be more proactive in the sense that we're doing kind of more routine monitoring, and not just looking where we might have a problem. Obviously, when we have a problem, we need to put things like point of use filter in, and we need to do something then to be able to take them off. But I don't have an answer for when that is. Obviously, it's probably when the TVCs fall below an acceptable level. But is that just because we've put an intervention in place? To answer your question about disinfection application, I think again, a lot of this research we're seeing is because we've got outbreaks and because we've got problems. So we probably need to think, I think, more proactively around the engineering, the design, and maybe the continuous disinfection, because there's no, there's, I think the science and the biology of these organisms and biofilm and what we know about that, they will always come back. So, as long as we've got water and nutrients, these organisms will come back, and it's probably only a matter of time before they're able to get into big enough numbers and get out of that wet environment and the healthcare environment that will cause infection again. So I think it needs to be about more kind of proactive disinfection or integrated strategies, combining maybe the physical and the disinfection approaches.
Okay, great. One final question from Islwin. What about possible long-term damage to pipe work, pitting to the metal, etc., or damage to the plastic by putting these disinfectants down the drain, sometimes at high concentration? Actually, the calculation of your 5% sodium hypochlorite mentioned at some point, that's 50,000 ppm. That's going to do some damage down there. So how do we manage that risk?
Yep, it's another fantastic question and consideration. I think acetic acid has some challenges, and I think I remember speaking to Islwyn about them using acetic acid at Leicester. So yeah, I mean, ultimately it comes down to kind of, I think, a bit of innovation and how we can ensure that maybe we've done a little bit with wipes, and we know when we're disinfecting a surface regularly that we've got no impact on the material compatibility. We probably need to start doing that with disinfectants for drains as well. Are we using things like peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide that we know should break down into kind of non-harmful byproducts? Or we may be using things like hypochlorous acid where we can dose it in continuously. Or do we kind of remove the whole disinfection approach and use things like UVC or heat or vibration or steam? So, but again, they might have challenges. So I don't have the answer, but I think it's probably something we should be considering around how we test the efficacy and safety of these disinfectants.
Okay, great. Phil, I've got one more really hard question for you, and then we're going to stop. So here's the scenario. You have a problematic drain in the clinical area, which you know is contaminated with CPE. You have an outbreak ongoing. What do you do with that drain based on the current evidence and the evidence in that review?
Me personally.
Yeah.
Um,
I told you it was a hard one.
Oh, I feel like I'm going to show a lot of bias. I put hydrogen peroxide and peracetic acid down it because I think from my research it's shown that it's probably one of the most powerful and oxidizing agents. But then I'd think more long term and I'd go for something more continuous. So I think about maybe UVC or heating or vibration.
Okay, great answer, and really fantastic session. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, cheers, everybody.
Let's just look at the last couple of slides, but just to say thanks to everyone for the questions today. They really do make these journal clubs work, and kind of point us in the right direction in terms of the things that you're interested in. So we have some next journal clubs lined up for you. If you look at our new website, the IPC Partners website, we've got a new Learn With Us section that's just been launched. So the QR code there should take you straight to it. And that's got the live schedule of upcoming events, which includes journal clubs. But actually new for 2026, we're going to try something new and put on some webinars, which will be a slightly different format. So a slightly longer talk to give a bit more insight on a topic that's important to you, but then plenty of time for question and answer afterwards. So look out for those. So the immediate next events, we have Alistair joining us in a couple of weeks to talk about turning the dial, feelings, families, and the future of IPC. And then I'll be bringing us home at the end of the year in December to think about economic evaluation of cleaning and disinfection. So as ever, recordings available on our YouTube channel. Please do take a look and subscribe. And thanks to you for coming today. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Phil. Bye for now.
Thanks, John. Bye now.